Hello, BookTube, and welcome to Poetry Thursday. Every Thursday we read a poem together, maybe a couple of poems, talk about it a little, as part of my ongoing psychodrama with this volume, 20th Century American Poetry. Ordinarily, in the normal course of a Poetry Thursday type thing, this is exactly what I would avoid. I would avoid this in favor of, I don't know, the Oxford Book of English Verse, something like that. But instead, I tackled this directly. It turns out I'm glad I did, because this is a really good anthology, but it's an anthology that is going to be at least halfway full of garbage. And a lot of you bloodthirsty little marmosets are waiting for that. You're waiting for me to reach 1959. You're waiting for me to reach the great turn in 20th century American poetry that spelled the death of poetry as a competitive genre in the literary marketplace. Not just in America, but anywhere. That psychodrama is playing out in this book, and that phenomenon is going to happen. We are going to get there. We are making our way through this book. But we're not getting there yet. Despite the fact that a lot of the poets that we're reading have death dates that are moving further and further forward, 70s, even the 80s, most of the poems that we're reading are in the 20s, or only a tiny bit later than that. There'll be a great leap forward, I guess you could put it, when the time comes. But the time is not here yet. Now we are dealing with the poet Hart Crane, a stereotypically tormented figure, a poet who took his own life, a poet with mommy issues, all the usual stuff. And all that stuff, the tortured pulling out of the hair, the late night yelling at the moon, the parent issues, the inconsistent work ethic, the fighting with editors, fighting with friends. Whenever you see that kind of perturbation in an author's life, there's always a reason for it, and it's always the same reason, and that reason is alcohol. We draw this mystical film over it all, but it's all just alcohol. It's just alcohol. Hart Crane was a raving, out-of-control alcoholic, and that is the reason for all the rest of it. If that weren't true, well, then none of the rest of it would be true. Even the parental stuff, none of it would be true. All of it was made 1,000 times worse by that drug addiction. And I don't know for 100% certain, but I would guess that not only was the decision to take his own life made while drunk, but that the act was done while drunk. I'd be willing to bet that. So many of the poets who are in this volume, including a couple that I knew personally, the typical way that editors put it is that they descend into alcohol, where the alcohol eventually just erodes their talent. And I think that's the standard line on Hart Crane. But when it comes to Hart Crane, we can hear the slight pitter-patter of the carnage that is coming. The carnage that so many of you are waiting for. You bloodthirsty little marmots. You're waiting for me to start raging against the poems that I read. And I won't rage against Hart Crane, because he was astonishingly talented. Amazingly so. But you can feel the slightest tremor in the ground of what's coming because of one particular thing. In fact, one particular poem, which he submitted to Poetry Magazine. And I've read it to you before in a totally different context of Poetry Thursday. I'm going to read it to you again today. He wrote a poem called At Melville's Tomb about Herman Melville. And he submitted it, and the editor liked it for its power, which you're going to sense right away. You're going to hear that power, even my inept reading. You're going to hear it. But the editor specifically said to him, I don't understand it. I think it's powerful, but I don't understand the figures of speech that are happening in it. And that poet was old enough so that they were thinking, I should understand the figures of speech. Not just in this poem, but in any poem. I should understand them. Do you hear it? The hoofbeats of what's coming? That question is bad enough, but Hart Crane's answer, which eventually was published, it was so good, it was so impassioned that it was published, was even worse. In his answer to that editor lies the germ of everything that's coming in the second half of this book. Because his answer to that editor was beautifully, passionately written. It was written while he was drunk. What's the trouble, Bubble? I'm railing against somebody. You must be familiar with that. Oh, you want to make your big trek? Here, everybody likes to watch this. You want to make your big trek? You're going to jump over to your chair. You could do it, baby. There you go. Now, are you going to make a bed, or are you going to futz around? They all prefer this to me talking about poetry anyway. Are you going to make a bed, or are you just going to lay down like an old lady? Oh, goodness. Oh, my goodness. What are you doing? Oh, no, no, you are going to make a bed. Oh. Oh, goodness. Oh. Oh. He is the cutest dog in the whole world. Anyway, where was I? All right. Hart Crane didn't just write back to that editor and say, well, I meant this, or here's what I had in mind for that. Instead, he wrote back and essentially said that metaphors don't have to make sense to the reader. There's a lot more to his defense than that, but at its heart, that's what he meant. At its heart, that's what his response was, that metaphors don't have to make sense to the reader. Which is absurd, and which he wrote that in the 1920s, but it is eventually going to take that sentiment, which is totally absurd, that is totally false, but that sentiment is eventually going to take over this book, and it eventually takes over a whole genre. Because where are you if you're writing something and the author of that something is saying, what I'm writing doesn't need to make sense to you? Well, you're certainly not in the literary marketplace. I don't know where else you might be, but you're not in the literary marketplace anymore. But anyway, so the first poem of his that I want to read you is At Melville's Tomb, which is great, and I've read it to you in one other context, because in a library tour once, years ago on this channel, I came across the beautiful Barnes & Noble hardcover reprint of Moby Dick, with original engravings and a lovely naked hardcover, a really solid hardcover. I love that thing. When Barnes & Noble briefly flirted with the idea of doing original design hardcover stuff in varied appearances. So they did Moby Dick, but they also did Dracula and whatnot, and everyone, and Gulliver's Travels, and they all look different in size, different in format and shape and whatnot. They abandoned that in favor of uniform classics, and then when they eventually got back to ornate collectible hardcover classics, they did them in just a uniform style, the fake leather ones that they have that are quite good, quite solidly made, but no, that original run of Barnes & Noble editions came and went. And I think Moby Dick was the first one. I'm pretty sure that it was. I was blown away when I got it. When we got it at the shop, I was blown away by it, how lovely it was. And it, bless its heart, has Hart Crane's poem in it. So I probably read this to you then, but I'm going to read it to you again. This is from 1926. Often beneath the wave, wide from this ledge, the dice of drowned men's bones he saw bequeath an embassy. Their numbers, as he watched, beat on the dusty shore and were obscured. The wrecks passed without sound of bells, the calyx of death's bounty giving back a scattered chapter, livid hieroglyph, the portent wound in corridors of shells. Then in the circuit calm of one vast coil, its lashings charmed and malice reconciled, frosted eyes there were that lifted altars, and silent answers crept across the stars. Compass, quadrant, and sextant contrive no farther tides. High in the azure steeps, monody shall not wake the mariner. This fabulous shadow only the sea keeps. I think you can see right away what I'm talking about. That is amazing. Only a poet could write like that. Prose artists can't write like that. That is astonishing. And of course the he in the poem is Melville. But although I think even through my reading you probably sense some of that power, I bet you also are sympathizing a little with that editor. And so am I. Because if you think that the more you delve into this poem, the harder you crack at it, the more sense it will make, you're wrong. A slight portent of things to come. A slight hint of what's coming. But in this case, a tiny hint, and overwhelmed not only by sense, there's quite a bit about this poem that makes sense, but also by that gorgeous incantatory beauty. And then we'll move to one other poem that is also from 1926, and that it doesn't have any of that. Because I didn't want to just tar Hart Crane with incomprehensibility, because he wrote plenty that wasn't incomprehensible. Didn't even have the germ of it. So we'll read one of those that isn't. This is my grandmother's love letters, and I have done this. The scenario in this poem. Some of you are probably old enough to have done the scenario in this poem. It is a real thing. Hart Crane did it, and he wrote a beautiful poem about it, about finding a cachet of love letters moldering in an attic. There are no stars tonight, but those of memory. Yet how much room for memory there is in the loose girdle of soft rain. Oh, sorry. God almighty, is this guy good. Let's do that. Let's do that again. Every phrase chiseled to sheer perfection. Just the type of phraseology that you remember and use forever. There are no stars tonight, but those of memory. Yet how much room for memory there is in the loose girdle of soft rain. There is even room enough for the letters of my mother's mother, Elizabeth, that have been pressed so long into a corner of the roof that they are brown and soft and liable to melt as snow. Over the greatness of such space, steps must be gentle. It is all hung by an invisible white hair. It trembles as birch limbs webbing the air. I ask myself, are your fingers long enough to play old keys that are but echoes? Is the silence strong enough to carry back the music to its source and back to you again, as though to her? Yet I would lead my grandmother by the hand through much of what she would not understand, and so I stumble, and the rain continues on the roof with such a sound of gentle, pitying laughter. So it's not just a static moment. The static moment would have satisfied most poets. That static moment of finding a cachet of letters under the eave of a roof on a rainy night. The letters have turned brown with age. They are as gentle as a snow, just liable to melt in your hand. They are as fragile as could be. That moment, the stanza where the narrator of the poem asks, are you strong enough to do this? It seems like a delicate little thing, but it actually requires a huge amount of strength to do. Are you strong enough to do that? Are you present enough to do that? That would be enough for most poets. But then he introduces action. His narrator is saying, I don't want you to be part of the past. I would lead you by the hand through things that you don't understand. I want to communicate with you. I don't just want to find your old letters. Marvelous. Absolutely marvelous. And heartfelt, and also a little bit pathetic, a little bit pitiable in a way that the more you know about Hart Crane's life, which practically minted the word tortured, the more you will understand the sentiments in this poem, if not the exact inciting incident. But the key that I'm trying to make is that, unlike a lot of what's coming, you don't need to know anything. You don't need to know anything in order to get the beauty of this. You don't need to know anything about Hart Crane, any of the things that he saw. Imagine how this poem, this exact moment, would be captured by some of the poets we are going to reach. Anyway, and also thanks to the fact that the Melville poem actually has Melville's name in the title, you've got all that you need there too. So there's a lot more of Hart Crane in this anthology. These two, the group of editors for this volume really like him. So they include a lot, and he also wrote a couple of major works that were known to be major, works that took him a long time, that he labored on for a long time, usually with financial help from friends or from official organizations. And those are excerpted at great length in here as well. He's given the full treatment. But those two are good enough for getting a taste of Hart Crane. I strongly recommend him, especially if you can find a good volume of his work that has a nice, generous biographical introduction. Because the more you know about his life, the more resonance you're going to get out of his verse. And that's it for your Poetry Thursday for today. We will move on next time to a man who Hart Crane alienated, as he alienated lots and lots of people. You don't have to go far in this anthology or any anthology to find a poet who started out his friend and ended up hating him. So we'll move on from there. Although in the case of our next poet, the feeling was mutual. But anyway, that's it for your Poetry Thursday. Hart Crane, can't do better than that. So we will move on closer and closer to our reckoning with fate. I will see you next time. Thank you, BookTube.